Hello and welcome to the third episode in a six-part series, Reimagining Your Business. This is an opportunity for us to dive into the mind of Amir Qureshi, who, as we all know, is an expert in business, finance, and strategy. Over the past two episodes, we really took an opportunity to dive into really keeping your business afloat during these critical times. And then our second episode really honed in on re-engineering your business. But as we were conversing in the second episode, we very quickly realized that it was very important for us to talk about the culture of an organization. And because we were so limited on time in the second episode, we thought we'd make a whole new episode around it. So today's episode, we are going to be talking about how to build a high-performing culture. So without further ado, I am now going to invite Amir Qureshi back online. Amir, welcome back.
Oh, hello, Imad. How are you?
I'm fantastic. It's extremely hot over here, but I believe heat is just a mindset, in my opinion. But all is well, alhamdulillah. I think there's been great traction with respect to the first two episodes that we've had, and really excited to dive into today's conversation, which is building a high-performing culture. Because as we all know, culture is absolutely important. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about how you're doing, because I understand you are a little under the weather. I hope it's nothing too serious, but it looks like you're back on track.
I seem to have recovered. I think it's just so cold, and I insist on walking to work and walking back. And sometimes it's like 0 degrees or -1 or something. But I believe it's part of my daily ritual, the exercise. I have to do it. So I must have caught a chill, but I seem to be fine now and ready and very excited about our topic today.
Awesome. Well, it's good to see you here, and it's good to see you very, very well. So we'll dive right into it around this idea of culture. Now, when we talk about sort of the idea of culture in itself, they say that a strong culture drives performance. Now, this is not only intuitively true, but is also validated by a significant amount of research. So there's an article that I came across by Harvard Business Review, and it's titled, How Company Culture Shapes Employee Motivation. So the question that I want to lead with on this is, if a culture drives performance, how do you drive, or better yet, build a strong culture?
So there is the million-dollar question, right? And the next CEO of IBM said about his time working at IBM that if he had realized that culture was the main game, he would have spent much more time on building the culture of IBM than he did, although he built it very successfully. So culture is absolutely the main game. And yet, most of us, especially the accounting and finance type, tend to overlook it, almost treat it as if it was a secondary thing. Yet, as you correctly said, it is what drives performance. And to build culture requires, like anything, a lot of effort. It requires commitment, and it has to start from the top. That's probably the first and the most important point. The culture has to be set from the top.
So I think leading into sort of that idea, culture is a significant, it should be rather, a priority for organizations to consider if they're looking to drive performance. However, in the interactions and engagements that I've had, I wouldn't say the vast majority of companies are actually following suit on that. So the question then would be, why is it so difficult for people to adopt a different culture? Is it the management? Is it the leadership? Why is it so challenging to grasp, really?
So one of the key points is actually, as you mentioned earlier, is to realize that it is an extremely important part of business success to have the right culture. And unless and until you have the right culture, you can have the best strategy, you can have all kinds of things, you can even hire good people, but they will not be able to perform. The strategy will not be able to be implemented effectively. So without the right culture, you will not succeed. And this is one of the things that a lot of companies overlook, the fact that you need to make a conscious effort to build culture. Unless you make that effort, invest time, money, spend time with your staff, showing them the right culture, leading with the right examples, then unfortunately your strategies and stuff will become unstuck.
That's amazing. And forgive me because I'm actually doing a quick Google search because I'm very familiar with a quote which says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I don't know who said it, so I was trying to find that
Yes.
name, but I haven't found it. But
I
that is so
think it's
relevant.
Peter Drucker's.
There you go, Peter Drucker. I think that name
Yes.
suddenly rings a bell.
Yes.
The management guru of them all. So in the context of reshaping the culture, I mean, one would assume that it's the person at the top who really shapes it. Now, I know that there's a certain extent that that's true, but if you can dive into who's responsible, can you highlight a little bit
This
of?
is a this is a good this is a good question, because there's been a lot of debate and discussion around this as to who is ultimately responsible. And the current thoughts, at least in Australia, the thinking around culture is that it is part of the board's responsibility to ensure the organization has the right culture in place. Now, of course, the board is not supposed to get involved in the day-to-day stuff. However, it's considered so important that in Australia, we recently had a royal commission to investigate the practices in the banking industry. And the Royal Commission, which is basically some ex-judges, came up with the conclusion that culture was so important that ultimately the board has to be held accountable and responsible for ensuring that an organization has the right culture. So it has to start with the board. The board then obviously delegates it to the CEO and his management team. But ultimately, the board has to set the values and the tone for the culture, and then it's up to the CEO to implement it. And the board has to keep him or her accountable for ensuring the right culture exists, because it's now well established, at least in Australia, that the board will ultimately be held accountable and responsible if the organization doesn't have the right culture.
That's interesting, because board didn't even come to mind. I always thought that perhaps the CEO might have been, but I think the initiator as well.
Yes.
The CEO, of course, takes in an incredible role. So you've highlighted a few points. I think values is something that I really want to drive into just a little later on.
Yes.
But I want to just get into this piece to make it a little bit more practical, perhaps. When we talk about sort of the importance of culture, and it's evident that it is extremely important. What must one do, as an initial step, perhaps, to start influencing the culture within their organization?
So one of the things we have to do as an organization is to figure out and define what sort of culture we actually want. And obviously, every organization is different. They have different approach to doing business. They may have different values. So we need to define the right culture for our organization. And that is something that has to be done in consultation with your senior management and basically your entire team. And the CEO is very instrumental in this discussion and debate. And you start off with actually asking people a simple question: what sort of culture do you want? And when I've done this exercise with lots of organizations, the words that come to mind frequently, which are thrown up in our discussions, everyone wants a culture based around teamwork. Everyone talks about a collaborative culture. They want a collegiate culture, so people are actually friendly and they get on well. They talk about a performance-driven culture. They also say they want a supportive culture where failure will be tolerated. If you don't succeed or if there is a problem, the organization or the team will support you. And on the opposite side, people are most concerned about a culture which is toxic, which involves a lot of politics, which has a lot of internal conflict. Those are the types of cultures people want to stay away from. So you need to define the sort of culture that you want. And like anything, I suppose, once you've defined the sort of culture you want, you have to then make a conscious effort. And there's a series of steps you actually have to implement to make sure you get to your desired state.
So what are those steps? Do you have them at the top of your mind?
Yeah, I suppose firstly, we have to agree on what our destination is. And so if we're going for a culture which is, based around teamwork, it's collaborative and so on, then we need to engage our team in terms of training, in terms of sharing our values and our culture and so on, ensuring that we enforce those kind of behaviors through performance management system. People who actually live that culture are rewarded. Those who do not live and breathe that culture are actually penalized. So it's one thing to have all of these things on a piece of paper or very nicely framed in your foyer or your reception, but ultimately it comes down to managing the performance of your team, especially the senior management team. So, for example, in my own firm, many, many years ago, we had one of our cultural values was that we will have zero tolerance for internal politics. And at one stage, we had a situation where an employee engaged in some kind of internal politics, and that employee was asked to leave. And that sent such a strong message within the organization, within the firm, that this is a firm which does not tolerate which has zero tolerance of internal politics, and that shaped the behavior of the rest of the employees. Now, sometimes you have to take such significant steps. Other times, maybe something less would suffice, but you've got to enforce these cultural values that you are aspiring towards. Otherwise, there is no point and you will not succeed.
And I love how you talked about the first step being acceptance. And it's not just acceptance from the top, it's acceptance across the board. So everybody is essentially playing a role in establishing a culture that is worthwhile within the organization. The other piece you were talking about,
Yes,
and I sort of
absolutely.
touched on it, was the idea of values. Now, we understand that values are the behavioral expectations of your brand. Now, values, and again, I see this a lot. It's unfortunate that I do, but values are mere words that are expressed either on the wall when you walk into somebody's office, or it's not really embodied within the fabric of the culture in any organization. So can you just talk to us a little bit about sort of the values and the importance it plays in an organization?
So very, very insightful comment that you just made, that a lot of the time values are just nothing more than words on a piece of paper, or in the CEO's office, or sometimes as you walk into an organization, you see them are values. Values, like anything else, have to actually be lived, and unless the organization practices those values, lives by them, there is no point. So an organization, for it to achieve success, has got to have certain values. And the most common could be in terms of, our approach to customer service, our approach to our employees in terms of having an entrepreneurial approach. All of these are examples of values that companies aspire towards. But essentially, unless you're living and breathing these things, then you're not going to have the success. So the values firstly need to be defined, and typically an organization will not have more than three or four core values. There's a lot of research which says ultimately an organization will have 3 or 4 core values and can have subsets of those values, or there could be a few others, but the core values will be not more than 3 or 4. So as an organization, you need to define what are these 3 or 4 things that you cannot live without, that you must comply with. And it could be, integrity, it could be honesty, it could be entrepreneurialism. Whatever they are, every organization is different, but you need to define those, and then you have to ensure that you live by those values.
I love that. I love how you sort of described it as what can you live without, or what can you not live without, rather, when it comes to thinking about your values, and then embrace that within the fabric of the organization. Now, what I've sort of often see that without enforcing or reinforcing the values on a very continuous basis, stated values become relics without relevance. And I picked this up from somewhere and I thought it was marvelous. Relics without relevance. So the question would be, how memorable must the company values be?
Well, a lot of companies have a different approach to how they actually practice and live by values. So some of the examples I've come across in my travels is one company, for example, had little cards where the values were actually written. And this was a company in Pakistan, so the values were written in Urdu. So, everyone from the most junior staff to the senior management was carrying around the same card. And they were expected to, look at it at least once or twice a day as a reminder of what values they were aspiring towards. And that's a wonderful practice. And when the CEO is doing the same thing, then, obviously the staff will actually follow. So you have to enforce these things. You have to live by these values. Because one of the examples I like to give, for example, in a lot of the discussions and trainings that I've done, is one of the values companies aspire towards is the fact that we will not engage in corrupt practices, right? So I always say the most profitable business in the world is selling drugs. So unless we had a value that we will not, we will not break the law, we'll deal with integrity, and we will, obviously do things which are acceptable, then we might as well all go in the business of, drug trafficking because it makes a lot of money. So essentially, if that's your values that prevent you from becoming, going into that line of business, even though financially you could actually generate a lot of money. Similarly, you could sell fake products. You can do all kinds of things. You can sell faulty products and make money. But if your values are clear in terms of, doing business with integrity, having a strength of character, then you're not going to engage in those practices. And that's what distinguishes good companies which have a long-term future from those which are only there for a few years and then disappear.
Excellent. And I'll sort of dive a little deeper into sort of what my thinking is around stopping to do things. Because when we're looking at values per se, what I often find is values are stated and the behavior in effect is sort of enforcing us not to do something. So we often talk about what we must not do. So I always encourage people and organizations rather to not only think about what you must stop doing, but as a result, what will you start doing to affect change? Because the definition in itself, the language that we use, really has a profound effect on the change that we wish to see. So if we start doing something and we start bringing that into our vocabulary, there will be a significant amount of shift as opposed to just talking about not doing something. That was just my 2 cents or thoughts on that.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Now, again, values is so important. So the question that I then want to bring up, and I think it's just going to dive deeper into what you've already expressed, is really how do you market values internally? At what rate, pace, how consistent must one be? And how does one go about doing that to reinforce the values that this organization is built upon?
So I was working with an organization some time ago, which actually wanted, so it was a long-term project, and one of my tasks was to help them build a high-performance culture. And so the starting point, if I use this as a case study and maybe give some practical insights into how we went about doing it. So the first step was to actually define what their culture was right now. So I remember working with the senior executives as well as some of the members of the board, and we did a quick confidential survey. What are the 5 words that come into mind? They had to write on a piece of paper, and which would describe your culture. And all of those things that I just previously touched on, toxic, unfriendly, all of the negative aspects of culture were highlighted by the senior management and some of the board members as well. So at least, while it was rather depressing, at least we had a starting point and we could move on. So the second part then was to, with the same group, asking them what sort of culture would you actually like to see in your organization. So then we came up with words such as collaborative, values-based, and so on. So we made a list of the 3 or 4 key things that we wanted to see in a culture. And then from there on, we created a whole series of events, activities, which would actually help us to encourage as well as motivate and guide our staff as to what our culture needs to be like. Then we carried that one step further and actually changed the performance management system to actually inculcate some of the values and the type of culture that we're wanting to shape. So the performance of the senior management team would be assessed based on whether or not they live by the culture that we were trying to establish. Now, so that would obviously, would go all the way down to the next layer of management and the staff and so on. But that was a process, and there was a whole series of events, everything from town hall style events where the board members would meet with the staff and talk to them about values, talk to them about culture and so on. Then there'd be regular catch-ups between the senior management team to see how they were progressing. So there was a plan for almost 12 to 18 months that was developed as a way of establishing the culture that they wanted and making sure it became a reality as opposed to just the sorts of things we're talking about where nothing happens.
Interesting. So the company that you're referring to now, how long ago was this exercise performed? And as a result, what was the outcome or the results that is, um,
Okay, so this would be about, I think, 18 months ago. Quite a large company I was working with. The results were mixed, frankly. And as a consultant, I'd like to sit here and say, "Oh, the profits doubled, revenue tripled, and all kinds of things." But what we learned from this experience is obviously there was some success we had, but we learned was that there were some barriers to implementing the culture successfully. And it wasn't so much the staff, but a lot of it was to do, it was a family owned enterprise, albeit a large one. The biggest problem or the barrier were the actual CEO and family members who were involved in the business.
hmm,
So this was a huge learning for me because we could do everything by the book, follow the right approach. But unfortunately, people at the top, the 3 or 4 people, were not engaged enough. They wanted to do all of this, but they were not willing to invest time and effort themselves. And that meant we only had limited success. It was still successful, but not to the degree that I would like to see.
no, for sure. And I think there's always going to be barriers. And I love how you use that word because there's things under the surface that don't come to fruition. And unless they're addressed, then progress is very difficult. And it's often seen as well, unfortunately, though it may be, is getting things done is almost like a checkbox that needs to be, it's almost a metric that, okay, we've done
Yes.
this, we've done this, we've done this. But, how do we ensure, because a lot of conversations that I have with employees within organizations, it's almost all talk, no action. So that's the
Yes.
summarized version of what they say. How do you then talk about action? How does that drive into action in terms of, if we're looking at top management who's talking the talk, how do you get to shift their mindset in this regard?
Yes, and I think when we at the outset we said that the culture has to be set from the top. So we have to engage with the CEO, the board of directors, and so on, and get their buy-in. And they have to be genuinely and totally committed. Otherwise, as consultants or as trainers, I know we will still get paid, but the results are not going to be 100% or what they actually want. So the first thing is, and sometimes you may want to walk away from a project like this where they have a superficial engagement and they're not really committed to it. So this is very important for us to establish that, are you really committed? Are you actually going to want to do these things? Because there's going to be some pain and suffering along the way. You're going to lose some staff members who may not want to embrace the change that you want to bring about. There may be long-standing staff members which will create problem for you in the short term. So once you have that commitment, then we move forward. And it's like anything. If you want to encourage teamwork, you have to set up opportunities for your staff to collaborate. You have to allow them time to interact with each other. You have to facilitate meetings. You have to engage in some team building activities. You've got to then link it to their performance management system. So an example that I often use is that in one of the American companies, every time a new graduate was hired by that organization, one of the senior executives was made responsible for his or her success within the organization. So one of the KPIs was, if Imad, as a 22-year-old, joins this company, then me, as the someone at a higher level of management, my performance will be judged on whether you're successful or not within that organization. If you left within 12 months because you were frustrated or you were not looked after, that will reflect badly on me. So what am I going to do as a high performing individual? I will put all my effort into helping you develop networks, coaching you, mentoring you to make sure you succeed. And that is genuinely then shaping the culture of the organization, because I'm doing it for my own self, but at the same time, in that process, I'm helping you. As you develop and grow, the organization benefits. So you've got to link it with performance.
Everything
Otherwise, it doesn't work.
that's
Yeah.
what they say. And it's
And the
funny.
performance management system, that's ultimately what shapes behavior and what drives and motivates people. Because if you don't penalize them for the wrong performance or don't reward them for the right performance, better still, then things will not change.
So then in essence, the leader needs to be the leader that everyone needs. And that's sort of going to help shift the culture.
Yes.
It takes time. I think in the overall context of things, it's not an immediate result that you're going to see. It's really driving change in a very gradual process and addressing one thing at a time to get to where you
That's
need to
right.
be.
And it's not the sort of thing you can look at one day and say, oh, we have a fantastic culture. Now we can put our feet up and relax.
Right.
Because it's not like, it's not so tangible.
And this also alludes quite nicely to your point in the previous episode, which was, do employees within an organization or a business, do they have stake in the business? And that I think is
Yes.
a big shift that happens because, if I know there's a downfall, then I'm going with the team, and if there's an uptake, then I'm also benefiting from it as well. And
Yes,
everybody
I
wants
think
to ensure that their business,
absolutely.
even if they're employed by them, to
Yes.
grow.
And the whole concept of being a business owner really, again, shapes and changes your thinking, and you become much more concerned about how the business is being managed, how it's run, how your customers are looked after, how your staff are looked after. Your attitude changes totally.
And you also sort of talked about, I mean, this is now coming to the world that you and I both live in. You being a consultant, me being a coach, and working with individuals, we get the opportunity to ask the very, very hard questions to really unsurface what's really, really important. And if we feel that it's not going anywhere currently, at least we've had the opportunity to plant the seed and hopefully it blossoms at some point down the future, but to step away. And, we also get flack for what we do to certain extents, but I think it's important to recognize that in the learning and development industry, and there's so many great people out there who really have this intent to not only help your business grow, because in the grand scheme of things, it's actually having a significant impact on the economy and we want to boom. But we've got to remove ourselves from sort of this selfish mindset to an extent. And I think I said this last time as well, and I'm saying it again, that we've got to get out of our own head if we want to really grow and prosper, not only for our business and our employees, but for sort of the country and the world at large.
I think that's very, very true. And I think there's a very famous saying which says, you can have anything that you want in the world as long as you help enough. So if you want to be rich and famous, you should help other people to be rich and famous.
I love that.
If you want a great job, and one of the things I was sharing with some young people recently is that ultimately, and whether you call it karma, whether you call it fate, whether you call it God's grace, ultimately it comes back to, if you do something good, it will eventually come back to reward you many, many times over. And I think that's very important from a business perspective as well. You treat your customers well. If you don't take a short-term approach, you don't look at just one single transaction and try to make all the money in one deal, ultimately they'll keep coming back to you and the business will grow and succeed. So you've got to take that
I
approach
love
to
that.
virtually all of your life, I would say.
I love that. I love your quote, and I love sort of your idea behind it. I'm a big believer of it, and if companies can start to do this, and then they can then express sort of the benefits of it to their peers and colleagues out in the community, then it'll create a ripple effect, which is amazing. So now that we're coming to the end of
Absolutely.
our time, I really want to
Okay.
thank you once again. I know you were just about to say something, and I'll let you do that in your concluding remarks. But I just want to thank you once again for coming on, braving your sickness, if you will, because you're looking absolutely fantastic. I think you forgot about it. I even forgot about it. But I
Yes,
really
I've forgotten.
you coming on and really diving into this idea of culture, which is what I really, really love across the board. So do you have any concluding
Thank
remarks
you.
before we close?
Well, just a couple of things then, just to wrap up what we've discussed, and we've sort of covered a lot of things. One of the reasons why culture is so difficult is because it's not something tangible. It is, a lot of it is unwritten, unsaid. And while it's very important, it shapes the behaviors and attitudes of the employees, but it's not something I can touch and feel. So this is one of the reasons why it is such a struggle. But just to to finish off with one little story about how Australia is dealing with this whole cultural issue. So recently, when we had a major inquiry in about the financial institutions in Australia, it was found that the culture was all wrong. So the culture was to basically make money for the bank at the expense of the customers. And that meant misrepresenting the facts, not being very honest and open and so on. And it created such backlash for the banks in Australia that now, as I was mentioning at the start, it's well established that the board has to accept responsibility for setting the culture. The board is also now required in most organizations to have what's called a culture audit. So organizations are now going, including government organizations, are now actually undergoing a proper, structured, rigorous cultural audit. And that goes through all sorts of things that we've talked about to make sure that the employees are behaving in the way that is expected of them and they're doing the right things. So this is where we've ended up in Australia. And this, I suppose, emphasizes and signifies the importance of culture. That's what we've been talking about all this time.
I love that. Thank you so much, Amir, once again. And to everyone watching right now, I hope you've gained immense value in the conversations that we just had. And Amir's highlighted a significant amount of information that culture is important. And you've got to put that at the top of everything else. Everything else will take care of itself. However, if your culture is not right, then it's very difficult to try and sort of follow through with what you need to do. So Amir, once again, thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, comments, and wants to dive deeper into a certain subject, then please leave it in your comments below. And inshallah, we look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.
All right, Imad. Take care. Bye. Take care.